affirmation or even recognition or rapid response. And we're going to talk specifically about currencies that might be valuable to a boss. Okay. Now, it's also important to recognize that there's a dark side to currencies. I don't know if Julie mentioned her Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, when she talked about strength, but there's a Darth Vader side to currencies. They can also be negative. And you need to be very careful about and thoughtful about using these, because over time, if you use these, they're going to really hurt your relationships. So examples of negative currencies would be withholding something, not giving recognition, not giving support, not providing challenge, even threatening to quit the situation. These are withholding type currencies. And you may do it unconsciously, right? So if you find yourself not having thanked someone for a long time or not providing challenge to your team and given an idea that, oh, well, maybe that person doesn't want a challenge, check with them, because you may actually be withholding something that they need. And then, of course, there are those directly undesirable, raising your voice, yelling, refusing to cooperate, escalating issues. You guys probably have worked for a few years, and this is familiar to you, but this is something early on. People look for an easy solution to difficult problems, and they think escalating issues is going to be the way to do that, but frequently it hurts relationships, and you really want to try to solve the issues directly with the person. Going public, attacking a person's reputation or integrity, those are all directly undesirable currencies. So if you're currently using any of these, or if you think you might be, the key thing to think about is, might I be damaging my relationships, and what could I use positive currencies instead of negative currencies? Okay. So the next step in this relationship, so we've talked about currencies, right? The next step in this relationship is dealing with relationships. So let's take a look at that. Now, a lot of people ask me when I teach these topics, how do I make? I feel, yes, I get it, Jenny, I get it, and I've got some relationships that could be improved. I have some things on that list that I made, people on that list that I don't have a great relationship with, but how do I fix that? Right? People ask me that. All right, and so we think generally that there are two ways that you can improve relationships. In most cases, the easiest way to improve a relationship is to start working together on tasks, to just basically start working together. And instead of bringing negativity into that, bring positive currencies into that. So working on tasks works when animosity is mild. You haven't been yelling at each other in front of big groups, right? Or there haven't been really serious long-term problems. If the task can be accomplished, even with the animosities, task success is likely to improve feelings. Culture represses being explicit. Some cultures, it's hard to be explicit. The ally may not be able to handle the directness. Your style is not suited to directness, and task failure would hurt you both. And so I'll give you an example of this. I have someone that I had a difficult relationship with, that I worked with a few years back, and then he even chose not to be on a project with me at one point. That didn't feel great either, but I let it go. And we recently got assigned to the same project, and so I actually reached out to the program lead and said, hey, with this particular person, I've had some challenges before, but I'm very positive about working with him. And, if you could check in with him, but just let him know I'm looking forward to working with him. She did that. She said, no problem. He's going to work with you. No problem. I said, great. So then we just started working together, and I made an extra effort to recognize him in meetings, to bring a positive attitude into those meetings, to thank him. Do you hear me using those currencies, right? To thank him for the work he did, to make sure he felt appreciated in the work he did. So I went full on active, bringing positive currencies into that. And it's working. It's absolutely working. And we're working together. And I feel like things have smoothed over and it feels better not to have that relationship kind of hanging out there that wasn't great. And we never had a deep talk or a heart to heart. We didn't need to because we don't work together that closely and it wasn't that bad, but it also wasn't great. So working on task and bringing in those positive currencies can be a great way to start improving relationships. Okay, let's say things really went off the rails, that there has been shouting and yelling or really difficult situations, right? And that you really can't work with this person, that there are deep challenges. And let's say this person is someone who welcomes directness and you can be direct and your culture supports it. In some cultures, some organizational cultures support this, some don't. That's when you might want to actually sit down and have a conversation about how do we get to a better place working together. Okay, I think this is much harder. It's not suited to my style, but if it's suited to your style, and there has been a lot of animosity, you can start by repairing the relationship. I'm a big fan of working on task and bringing positive currencies into that. New day, we are allies, all of that. So that's some insights on improving relationships. Okay, so we're going to have 2 slides talking about specifically managing up, influencing your boss. And then we'll have a quick quiz and take a 15-minute break and come back and work on culture. Okay, culture and working across different cultures globally. All right, so first, influencing your boss. So it's a very similar process, right? You assume they're an ally or partner. You take your time to understand his or her world, understand what your currencies are and how to relate to that person. That's the frame of mind you want to be in to create a positive relationship. Limiting factors, and if you're doing any of these, you've got to say, oops, this is just not going to be effective. I might be right. That there are problems. I may be right that they're going to express displeasure, but even if you're right, you're not going to be effective, right? So it's about being effective rather than right. So if you're thinking they're a problem, if you tend to withhold information, if you're focusing on your own needs over your boss's needs, I mean, your needs are important. I'm not saying your needs aren't important, but in this interaction with your boss, you're going to be more effective if you focus on their needs. If you're afraid of displeasure, if you're outshining the master, this is a tricky one. You want to be great at your job. You want to be, someone who's got a great career ahead of you, and yet you want to also make sure that some of that light shines on your boss as well. Because if you're only shining the light on yourself and not your boss, that's going to limit the relationship. Or on the completely other side, if you're too compliant, if you're always saying yes, if you're always doing what they say, whether or not you agree. So these are some limiting factors. If you think you might be doing some of these, you want to dial them down and see if you can create that exchange, that influence relationship where you're really understanding your boss's world, what they value, and what your currencies are and how you want to relate to your boss. So let's look at the currency list and think specifically about currencies that might be valuable to a boss, right? So these are similar currencies to that we had on the earlier slide, but they're very specific to managing up. And I found people often find this list incredibly helpful, right? So again, as I'm reading this list, think about what your boss values, what you're currently using, and what else you might use on this list. So let's look at what this list is. Well, performing above and beyond what is required. That's a good one. If you can be that person who really does a great job and is shining that light, then that is a currency. Your boss not having to worry about your area. And this is a little bit more tricky because sometimes you want to bring problems and challenges to your boss, but you also want to bring that confidence to your boss that you've got this covered, you've got this handled, because your boss probably has a whole bunch of challenges that they're dealing with. And if all you're doing is kind of bringing up the challenges without creating that really strong sense that you've got this, you're not maximizing this particular currency. Knowing subordinate will take into account political factors in an organization. I'll tell you, when I worked at a university, this was huge for me. And people who I trust to navigate the politics and have the right types of conversations outside of our group simply got better work, right? They got better projects and more interesting things. So, think about what your predisposition is to politics. And you may not agree with some of the politics. You may not even like some of the politics in your group. But how you manage those reflects back on you and will reflect back on you with your boss. Bosses sometimes like to rely on subordinates as a sounding board. One of the things that you'll find as you go further and further in the organization is you hear less and less. You would think you would hear more as a boss, but you actually hear less. And some of you may have already had the experience where you've been promoted and suddenly your friends and peers are treating you differently and not telling you everything. This is a normal human thing that happens in organizations, right? So when you do have someone who works for you, who can be a sounding board, who can listen, who can share information with you, that's a value to a boss. So I've talked about that already, ability to rely for information from other parts of the organization. That's based on your network and how strong your network is and what information comes through your network. Keeping your boss informed of problems. No surprises. Nobody likes surprises. We think we like surprises, but we really don't like surprises, especially at work. So making sure that you've got that good communication going. How you represent your boss to other parts of the organization. So if you can have that positive approach externally, or at least not talk about the negative things, that's going to create influence for you. Being a source of creativity and new ideas. That's a great one. Defending and supporting the boss and organization's decisions to your own subordinates. So if you don't agree with the decision, at least support it, right? Because we know we have to move forward somehow. And, all of these have kind of a Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader side, where the Darth Vader side is you're talking behind your boss's back, you're saying bad things about them to other people, you're not supporting their decisions. That's only going to come back on you. That's only going to hurt you eventually. Providing support and encouragement, we all need it, even bosses, and taking the initiative with new ideas, preventing problems before waiting them to happen. Now, when you look at this list, again, it feels kind of obvious, right? Because, those things all intuitively make sense. The purpose of this list is, are you really using these? Are you really maximizing your use of these in your organization so that you really are this critical, important person who's able to influence your boss when you need to go and make a case for a new project or ask for a raise or all of those good things. So I'd love for you to chat in now. The answer to the last question, is there something on this list that you're not currently using or not currently using very much that you might use? What is there something here that might work with your boss that you're not doing or not doing very much? Go ahead and chat that in. New ideas. Nice one, Jan. Love it. What else? Yes, MF. This is a huge one. I can't tell you how important this is. And I've made a mistake. We all make mistakes with this. Nice, HW. We've got new innovation coming through the ranks here. Interesting, DG. So getting that balance between I've got this covered and keeping your boss informed. Love that reflection. Great one. Okay, so we are going to do two quick quiz questions, and then we'll take a 15-minute break and come back and learn as often what's not said or what's said indirectly that is the most important thing. And part of the communication skill that you need to develop in a high context culture is interpreting and understanding that the important things may be left unsaid. So whereas in a low context culture, you get really good at articulating things and describing them concretely, in a high context culture, you get very good at indirect communication and understanding and interpreting indirect communication. So that's the communicating scale. The second scale in Meyer's model is the evaluating scale. And this is how you give negative feedback. That could be a negative job performance. It could be a negative contribution to a project, whatever that feedback. So her second scale is people who give direct negative feedback and people who give indirect negative feedback. And I'm going to talk about Americans on the next slide when I explain the next slide, because Americans are tricky on these two scales. Okay. The third scale is persuading. Persuading, and this was one that I wasn't sensitive to this until I read Meyer's book, and it was really interesting to me. So persuading, she contrasts principles first versus applications first. So let me give you an example of a presentation. A principles first presentation would start with the high level goal, all of the context, all of the data and results, and then end with a recommendation. That's principles first. Applications first, which is Americans fall more into the applications first persuading, is around first giving the conclusions and then showing how you support the conclusions, right? And so knowing, and Germany is an example of a principles first. So you may have a German and American colleague, and they both have done great work, but the American's saying, why is this person giving me all this information without telling me the recommendation? The German is saying, why is this American going straight to the recommendation? They must not have done their work to really develop it well, right? So that's an example of misinterpretation across the persuading scale. Let's look at leading. So leading, egalitarian versus hierarchical, right? So do you have a tendency to ask everyone and refer to everyone and make decisions in collaborative ways? Or is your culture more hierarchical, where you really look to someone who is superior to give the guidance, and then you follow that guidance? So that's the leading scale. The deciding scale is consensual versus top-down. So that's a bit related to the leading scale, but are you a culture that tends to rely on consensus to come to decision, or are you a culture that tends to be more top-down, looking to the leaders again to make decisions? Is trusting task-based or relationship-based? We talked about that a little earlier. This is a different frame, same words, a different frame. So do you trust people because you're working together on a specific project? That project is defined, you're professionals, you both know what your contributions are, and therefore you can build trust that way? Or do you need to first build a relationship with that person before you can get down to work? Do you need to go out to lunch with them? Do you need to understand a little bit about their family or where they're from before you can really trust them in a work environment? So that's another scale. Disagreeing, do you tend to be confrontational or avoiding confrontation? And last but not least, linear time versus flexible time. So linear time tends to be kind of northern hemisphere, and flexible time tends to be more southern hemisphere. Does time, are you really counting the minutes, or does tomorrow mean as soon as I can get to it? All right, so let's go back to this scale that I showed you here. And here I've mapped the United States, India, and Austria. And I just picked these randomly, right? But it's kind of an interesting thing. So you'll see that, let's look at the first two scales. High context versus low context, and direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback. Well, I told you the Americans are very interesting in this, right? So Americans tend to be very low context. The lowest context are supposed to be the Dutch. The Netherlands, the Dutch are supposed to be the lowest context, but Americans are pretty far over there, right? We tend to be very concrete, explain things in a lot of detail, So an Austrian I may need to listen more to an Austrian because they're not going to communicate as directly. Americans, though, tend to give indirect negative feedback. And so there's a story in Meyer's books where she talks about a woman from, this is France, it's a European woman from France. She's gone to Chicago. She works for a multinational corporation. She's gone to Chicago and she gets her first performance review. And in that performance review, her boss says, well, an American, her boss is an American, we could have done a little better. I think things might have gone a little better. I mean, overall, you did a pretty good job. It's not bad, but, I think there's some room for improvement, but it was a pretty good job. That's indirect. You really did a terrible job. American feedback, right? But the woman from France walked out and thought, I'm doing great. She interpreted that as not negative at all. So these are the types of things that this can show. So we've got India over here on the right. In general, the high context, indirect feedback, hierarchical, top-down, relationship-based, and avoiding confrontation tends to be more in Asia generally, although it varies a lot. And if you're super interested in this, Erin Meyer has a website. You can get full access to this mapping tool for a day, for 24 hours, for like $3. And you can go and map whatever cultures you're currently working with and see how that works for you. And you can also get a specific feedback on your own style so that it's not even just your country style, but your own style. So for anybody who gets super excited about this or interested in it, she does have a website and you can find that. Okay. So again, these are the, I'm not gonna read through all of these slides, but I've given you the specific definitions if you want to go back to it when you're looking at these slides and would like to understand what these different scales are. Now, I talked about principles first versus applications first persuading, right? So principles first being that you develop a theory or a complex concept before you present a fact, statement, or opinion. You give the high-level theory and then data, and finally you get to your conclusion, right? Whereas applications first, you tend to start with a fact or a statement and then back it up. So there's a very interesting thing about persuading because there's a third way that's common in Asian cultures, but really doesn't fit anywhere on this scale. And so, let's see, I talked about this. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Before I get to that, let me just kind of reemphasize. So this is the communicating and evaluating. I already gave the story about this, kind of communicating versus low context and high context and evaluating. This is just a fun graphic about this, and I'm going to let you guys read this. People have told me it's very true. I can't say exactly because I'm neither British nor Dutch, but this is an example of where the communication breaks down in terms of direct and indirect. In this case, the British are more indirect and the Dutch are more direct. So I'm going to let you just read through that and hopefully get a chuckle. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that. My favorite is the bottom one. When the British say, I'm sure it's my fault, and they mean it's your fault. The Dutch understand it's their fault. Okay, So this is where I started to go, and I'm going to explain now, because I think this is super interesting. So remember, we have principles first versus applications first. But in Asia, there tends to be something that Meyer calls a holistic worldview. And this, again, is a really helpful concept to understand. Oh, you work with Dutch? Okay, MD. This is a really helpful concept to understand. So the idea of a holistic view, so this is an example in a picture of the difference between an American portrait and a Japanese portrait. So two photographers, one's American, one Japanese, were said to go into a room and take a portrait of a woman, right? Given the same thing. And the American took the portrait on the left. And the American portrait is focused on the face, right? That if you want the essence of this person, you want to see their face, their expression, how they are in, how they are. That's the idea of an American portrait. On the right is a Japanese portrait. So the Japanese photographer would say, the American portrait is incomplete. It only shows the face. It doesn't show the context that person is in. It doesn't show where they are. It doesn't show their entire self and the context that surrounds them. And so to persuade in Asian cultures, according to Meyer, you need to be able to provide that full context before you get to your main point. This is different than creating principles and showing data, but this is starting to describe the entire situation around a specific problem or challenge before you get to that challenge. And if you listen to that, if you have colleagues, you may be familiar with this already, you may speak this way. If you don't speak this way, if you listen to colleagues, I can remember I was interviewing, this was for a research report I was doing, and I was interviewing someone in China, and I asked a question about a product in their company. And he started with, well, let me tell you about what happened historically when we were thinking about our customers 4 years ago, and told this long story, and then finally at the very end answered my question. And I mean, literally took 10 minutes. And I had happily read this framework before, and so instead of being kind of confused why he wasn't answering my question, which would be a typical American response, I was able to just listen to the story and enjoy and realize he was painting this broader portrait that he felt was very important for me to know before he could answer my question specifically. So really fascinating stuff. Hope that you have enjoyed this. Again, this is a framework that's available to you if it's of interest. So 4 quick ideas in terms of bridging barriers, and this could be cultural, but this could not be cultural. This could be just people that you have challenges working with, right?